Camera moves around. Okay.
Mm.
Oh, incredible.
Marvellous. You should be able to hear me now. I'm going to move the camera a little way. Can you hear me? I'm sure you can hear me.
But someone put their thumbs up.
Yeah. Hearing me? Ah, yes. Wonderful. Right.
Perfect. Okay.
Here we go. So, welcome to our final session of Heritage with me, Samuel Woodall, and my colleague Jack Thompson. And today we're going to be looking at Disraeli and Oakeshott, two quintessential figures in the formation of what is today known as One Nation Conservatism. Reflection. This sort of answers a couple of questions, but also I sort of left it up to sort of discussion, but I think you are right in the sense of we should round off here. But as we come to the close of our Heritage series, it's worth reflecting on the journey we've taken from the philosophical foundations of the ancients to the cultural and political thought of the moderns. We began with Plato exploring the perennial question of order, not merely in the state, but in the soul. His Republic gave us the architecture of hierarchy and virtue that would echo through the centuries of Western philosophical thought. From there, we turned to Augustine, whose City of God bridged classical philosophy and Christian theology. Augustine transformed the Platonic search for the good into a drama of divine and earthly citizenship, setting the terms for how faith and authority would be understood for over a millennium. The conversation then moved forward to Joseph de Maistre, passionate fan over here, the counter-revolutionary philosopher of providence and punishment. De Maistre forced us to confront the darker side of order, authority rooted not in consent but in transcendence and necessity. With Edmund Burke, we entered the modern age of politics. Burke's reflections on the revolution in France articulated a vision of continuity, of reform grounded in inheritance rather than rupture. His notion of society as a partnership across generations provided one of the most enduring defences of tradition and heritage. We then moved on to examine Roger Scruton last week, whose modern conservatism translated the moral intuition of Burke into a philosophy of beauty, belonging, and the sacred. Scruton's concern with home, culture, and stewardship helped us see conservatism not as nostalgia, but as a living moral ecology. Finally, our series concludes with a discussion of One Nation Conservatism. It could be said the modern British expression of these deeper inheritances, a vision seeking balance between liberty and social obligation, between tradition and reform. So for those of you who were here in our first session, Peter, why concept, not an ideology? This may sound like a repetition, but I thought it was important to maybe just chuck this back in as we're coming to a close. So we called this series Heritage rather than Conservatism quite deliberately. As intellectual historians, we are wary of what Skinner calls the myth of prolepsis, the temptation to read present ideologies and conceptual frameworks back into the past. The idea of heritage allowed us to explore the conceptual roots and moral vocabulary of conservative thought without perhaps confining our discussions within the boundaries of a particular political label. It let us trace an evolving conversation from Plato's order to Burke's prudence to Scruton's love of home, as part of a broader intellectual inheritance rather than, say, a partisan creed. Intellectual historians are often cautious about approaching conservative thought as a fixed or trans-historical ideology, precisely because doing so risks what Skinner famously called, again, the myth of prolepsis, the tendency to project contemporary categories and meanings back into the past. To treat conservatism as an eternal disposition rather than as a historically contingent vocabulary is to misunderstand how ideas emerge, evolve, and, very much, as we've seen, respond to their own contexts. Historians such as J.G.A. Pocock and Donald Kelly have argued that we study conservative thinkers not as participants in a single sort of linear tradition, but they each grapple with crisis, authority, and change in its own time. These are distinct discursive moments. In this light, figures like Burke or de Maistre are not conservatives in the modern party political sense, big C, but more moral and political theorists articulating responses to rupture, to revolution, and the challenge of modernity. For intellectual historians, then, the task is to reconstruct the language of preservation, order, and inheritance in our own terms, resisting the temptation to read them as early expressions of an ideology that would only later take a coherent shape in the more contemporary modern world. So let's set some context then. We've just been talking about context, why we've done the series the way that Jack and I and Dara have composed this series. The politics of the 19th century. The 19th century was an age of profound political transformation in Britain, defined by reform, industrial growth, and social upheaval. Between 1801 and 1901, the population of England and Wales nearly quadrupled, rising from around 9 million to 32 million, as industrialisation drew millions into expanding towns and cities. The Reform Act of 1832 broke the monopoly of the rotten boroughs, extending the vote to the middle classes and signalling the decline of purely aristocratic politics. The Chartist movement of the 1840s, with its demand for universal male suffrage, revealed growing democratic pressure from below, while the Second Reform Act of 1867, and later the Third in 1884, expanded the franchise to include further large sections of the working population. Meanwhile, the Great Exhibition of 1851 embodied a sort of self-confidence of industrial Britain, whose empire by the century's end governed over a quarter of the world's population. Yet beneath the surface of progress lay sharp tensions, dislocation of labour, debates over moral order and poverty, and struggles over the meaning of a nation. In an age of empire and reform, it was within this dynamic and uncertain landscape that new visions of political identity and responsibility began to take shape. I'll just have a little sip. That's okay with you.
Of course.
So Benjamin Disraeli, he lived between 1804 and 1881, and he stands as one of the most complex figures, I'd say, in the 19th century British political and intellectual life. He was a novelist, he was a statesman, twice Prime Minister, 1868, and then again from 1874 to 1880, whose career embodied the union of imagination and authority. He was born into a Jewish family that converted to Anglicanism in his youth. Disraeli's early life as a writer profoundly shaped his political vision. He viewed politics not as mere governance, but as a grand narrative of identity, duty, and nationhood. And of course, his Jewish background meant that before Rishi Sunak, he was essentially the first and only leader from a minority background as a prime minister, even though, of course, as I've said, he converted, so he wasn't technically a practicing Jew, but he was of that background, which is quite interesting to be a Tory in that background, but we can sort of get into some of these kind of bits and pieces. But his early novels, Vivian Grey, Coningsby and Sybil, fused romanticism with social critique, diagnosing the dislocation of industrial Britain and the widening gulf between rich and poor. Intellectually, Disraeli forged what might be called a romantic, so we've covered the romantics, or imaginative conservatism, seeking to balance the moral continuity of tradition with the demands of modern society. In an age defined by utilitarianism, or on the flip side, laissez-faire individualism, he re-enchanted Tory thought with an appeal to faith, history, and the symbolic unity of a nation. His one nation ideal, that the privileged bear obligations to the powerless, or in French, this idea of noblesse oblige, offered a moral counterpoint to industrial capitalism and remains a central concept in conservative thought. For the intellectual historian, Disraeli's significance lies not only in his political achievement from social reform to imperial vision, but in his effort to transform conservative politics into a language of national imagination, most vividly expressed in Sybil, his meditation on the two nations of Britain. So, a bit of context for Sybil. One second. What's happened here? Make sure that's all. Sorry, there we are. Technical issue. Fine, I think that's okay. So Sybil, or The Two Nations of 1845, was written at the height of Britain's industrial transformation, a period when the optimism of progress was shadowed by the stark realities of inequality and social dislocation. The 1840s, often termed the Hungry 40s, were marked by economic depression, urban overcrowding, and waves of popular unrest, such as the Chartist movement, which demanded political representation for the working classes, while the Corn Laws were a flashpoint for debates over free trade versus social justice. Industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds had grown explosively, yet millions lived in squalid conditions with little access to education, sanitation, or a political voice. It was against this backdrop that Disraeli, already a rising Conservative MP, composed his tract Sybil, drawing on his tours of industrial Britain and his growing conviction that the Tory party must speak for the whole nation. He sought to expose the moral cost of industrial modernity. The novel's famous phrase that England had become two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy crystallised the widening gulf between the wealthy and the poor, and called for a new sense of social responsibility, rooted in shared heritage rather than class antagonism. In this way, Sybil was not merely a work of fiction, but a political intervention and imaginative attempt to re-enchant conservatism as a moral creed capable of healing the divisions of the age. And here is that excerpt that we will look at first. I'll read it in a Victorian booming voice. The two nations scene. The stranger paused. Egremont was silent, but looked inquiringly. Yes, resumed the younger stranger after a moment's interval. Two nations between whom? There is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones, or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by a different breeding, are fed by a different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. You speak of, said Egremont, hesitatingly, the rich and the poor. Okay, I'd like to throw the microphone over to you, and thereby the camera, which I will spin round menacingly in some sort of Orwellian fashion. Let's see. Well, there's Dara. You got a wave, Dara. There's Jack.
Hello.
The boxes. And there's our two regulars, especially Peter. But I'll move it back sort of so that we're kind of central.
Is it possible to make it wider?
No, I think that's going to be about the extent of it.
Okay.
I can zoom in. Right, there we are. Anyway, who has a thought, idea? What is Disraeli trying to say? He's not prime minister yet, at least for his longer term, and we have a long way off for his long term. But what's Disraeli analysing? What's he trying to say from the context that we've just looked at, and then the tract itself that we've just read? What's he trying to put across? How is he analysing Victorian Britain in the mid-century of Victorian Britain?
Well, it seems to me to be almost a very modern narrative. I read the first few books of it this morning and this afternoon, and the density of the text, the density of the references, it's the kind of thing I thought he wrote much later.
Yeah, he's still a young man, really. Well,
yeah, he's in his 40s, but still, I mean, he had another 40 years to go. It's very interesting. He seems to be saying that conservative policy is ordered towards the preservation and the growth of a certain order of affairs, especially economic, which is leaving a whole world of people behind. And there's not been sufficient conversation about how the products of the Industrial Revolution are going to get filtered, as it were, back into the soil.
I mean, it's very similar to what you might observe now, in the sense that it's like a two-tier society that maybe he's observing, in the sense that you've got the rich and the poor. Now, Sam, you said about the Corn Laws, being a really significant driving
Definitely.
amongst the poor. Now, amongst that, you had especially up north, you had massive social problems, like riots going on. You had the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, right? A very significant time before this was even written. But a lot of what he was thinking and what he was saying in this text would be informed as a result of of things that were happening, especially up north during the time that he's talking about and what he's referencing.
Definitely. I think it's interesting because, I mean, the 19th century isn't my area of expertise, but what is interesting about the 19th century is and there's this obviously famous term by the end of the 19th century, the kind of fin de siècle, the kind of end of the century period, where industrialization and urbanization have had such an intensity that there's very much a loss of, and the post-structuralists in the 40s and 50s would love to analyze this, there's a loss of kind of an authentic sense of place, an authentic sense of self. Who are we in this kind of rapidly modernizing world? And I think what perhaps Disraeli is analyzing is that, and it was interesting, Jack, that you said this was sort of a new phenomenon, and Dara also, you said you could see parallels with today, because I think also what's interesting about this period is that he's looking back nostalgically. He's looking back to a time, and this is why I used that term interjected with the term noblesse oblige. There was a period that the statesmen in the 19th century looked back to, which was this kind of feudal order that, as much as it was obviously very regimented, and as kind of the more left element of this reading club, Bruce, you and I would probably equally criticise the feudal order. But for a Tory politician, there is a certain romanticism of this bygone age where your lord of the manor did provide a certain sense of kind of, here's your place, here's your land to work, your seed to plant, this sort of thing. And there was a regimentation, but there was at least an image of a helping hand given by each element of society. As William James calls it, know your station, know your sort of place, and thereby society will work well. This comes back to these Platonic ideas of a kind of well-functioning state. So there is a certain nostalgia there, but also a looking to the future in a more modern way of kind of, there's the Chartist movement, which has got going only 5 years before this book is published, demanding rights for the people of the nation, demanding a say and a share in society. So there is very much a modern context to this, one that we can relate to more than many of the texts that we've covered so far, but also a nostalgia for a bygone age where, chivalry, duty, responsibility was the order of the day. And for Disraeli, he thinks that this is falling away in this kind of urbanizing world, because you've got to remember, this is a cry to the Tory party to follow his advice, but actually what were the Whigs would then become the Liberals, this party of free trade, of commercialism, actually for many people at this time was seen as sort of the worst evil, in the sense that they were looking towards private interests and opening up the economy, making money and profiteering. And perhaps Disraeli's vision of the Tory party was one that actually stands for, well, obviously, we like the idea of a thriving economy, of a thriving modern Britain, but we still have to think about what are our duties to people who don't get on that sort of wave of free trade that the Liberals were promulgating. So those are a couple of political and historical contexts. Do we have any more points about, even more of a linguistic or a literary way? How does this sound? What's the way he's saying this?
Make a couple of political points.
Please do, Bruce.
So how it feels to me is nostalgia is something that the rich, love, because it keeps them rich. I'm not sure it's something the poor are equally interested in. It seems to me this is happening at a time post Adam Smith. I don't know quite where Ricardo and others fit in, but there's basically, we're moving away from a feudal system to experimenting and trying to get a capitalist system going, and the poor are suffering without a doubt, because a lot of mistakes are being made about, pay the minimum wage, and the rentiers and the capitalists take profit because they take risk. And there's all that sort of economic thought that's out there.
Yeah.
And of course, because there's change happening, and there was the French Revolution just a couple of decades before, then those who have had power and continue to have power and wealth are saying, well, hang on, the poor are suffering, and if we let them suffer, or we have them suffer too much, then we're going to have our heads chopped off, or there'll be a revolution of a kind that we don't like. And the Corn Law is an example of where that came very close. So it seems to me, as it was in the time of Plato, and I probably argue in the time of St. Augustine as well, is that those in power are seeking to consolidate that power by finding a new message. Could be a romantic message, could be an aristocratic message, could be a religious message.
Yeah.
To basically retain and continue in power.
Very true. And you raise a brilliant point about revolution, because of course at this time, not to sound too rest is history, we need to leave that for the podcast, Jack, but the storm clouds of revolution in 1845 are gathering over Europe, because in Germany, in Belgium, you will have uprisings that will go far beyond the Chartist movement in Britain, and will somewhat successful, somewhat failure, but 1848, the year of revolutions across Europe, will see political violence across a whole spectrum of countries across the continent.
This one I want to see. You've got the left. You've got the communist Marx British Library work taking place at this point in time.
Yeah.
There's a left-wing ideology building up. There needs to be a response to it.
Very, very much. And in Germany, you've had your Max Sterners and these kind of proto-anarchists, proto-communists, who are writing these kind of revolutionary tracts as well, at the same as even before Marx. So there is certainly, on an intellectual level, an awareness of this, but also on a practical level, it's clear that there is unrest across Europe, and the Chartist movement is a sign of potential unrest across Britain.
If I could add maybe something, the corn law, was that a tax?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And the repeal of the Corn Laws, which is happening around this time. And Dara, you were raising this. Did you write about this or something at one point?
Yeah, I did. I did it in A levels, and I think I did a project on it at university, although that was a few years ago. So, but I do know quite a bit about Corn Laws and all that sort of stuff.
Again, for free trade, for example, with the disestablishment of the East India Company as well. After the Sepoy Mutiny that happens in mid 19th century, and again a more sort of free trade element to removing these kind of big royal charters that at one time would have been seen as a kind of way of sort of ensuring maybe a job for certain people, or ensuring a sort of regulated. Now, we have our obviously very major modern criticisms of the organizations, but at the time there were people thinking, well, if we're just going to open all of these big organizations up for free trade, it would be a little bit like our modern equivalent of privatization in the 1980s. It would be sort of like, oh, well, okay, but what's going to come next? Is it just going to be profiteering individuals all over the place trying to make money for themselves? I'd like to move on to the next one, because I realise we're at past and we still haven't finished Disraeli. And we've got 2 centuries of intellectual thought to cover. But I'm going to rush through this speech. Egremont's later reflections and dialogue with Sybil. And now, and can I not feel for men, my fellows, whatever be their lot? I know you will deny it, but you are in error, Sybil. You have formed your opinions upon tradition, not upon experience. The world that exists is not the world of which you have read. The class that calls itself your superior is not the same class as ruled in the time of your fathers. There is a change in them, as in all other things, and I participate that change. I shared it before I knew you, Sybil, and if it touched me then, at least believe it does not influence me less now. Strength. If there be a change, said Sybil, it is because in some degree the people have learnt their lesson. Dismiss from your mind these fallacious fancies, said Egremont. The people are not strong. The people never can be strong. Their attempts at self-vindication will end only in their suffering and confusion. It is civilization that is affecting this change. It is that increased knowledge of themselves that teaches the educated their social duties. There is a dayspring in the history of this nation, which those who are on the mountaintops can as yet perhaps only recognize. You deem you are in darkness, and I see a dawn. The new generation of the aristocracy of England are not tyrants, not oppressors, Sybil, as you persist in believing. Their intelligence, better than that, their hearts are open to the responsibility of their position. But the work that is before them is no holiday work. It is not the fever of superficial impulse that can remove the deep fixed barriers of centuries of ignorance and crime. Enough that their sympathies are awakened. Time and thought will bring the rest. They are the natural leaders of the people, Sybil. Believe me, they are the only ones. Now, what are we getting here? Because I think we're getting multiple things. We're getting the nostalgia, but I think we're also getting a certain Enlightenment tone also coming through here. This kind of idea. We're getting a Platonic tone of the educated ruler. We're getting, but we're also getting this idea of the Enlightenment opening up, in the previous century, you'd had this idea of the kind of enlightened despot, you know, the ruler who opens his mind to the arts, to culture, to intellectualism. What are we seeing Disraeli putting across here?
You can't use force. You have to reason with people.
Yeah.
That's the concept of the Enlightenment. People can think for themselves. Therefore, you can't just tell them to get back to work. That's that was feudalism. That isn't what you can do nowadays.
Yeah.
You have to reason with them, and we need a new rationalism.
And of course, from a Foucauldian perspective, this would be integrate them into the system. It will pacify them. Jack.
Yeah, I'm struggling to grasp it. So
I feel a debate building up here, actually.
Yeah. So okay. So the top half, he's drawn this distinction between tradition and experience, or received notions of who we are and how things are organised, and no longer applicable. So we have to wake up to a kind of change, I presume. The change that he's referring to is the two nations, the social divide. And he goes on to talk about, and this is what I'm struggling to connect to, is that the people can never be strong. Their attempts at self-vindication will end only in their suffering and confusion. So the poor can't help themselves. Why is that? It is civilization that is affecting this change. It is increased knowledge of themselves that teaches the educated their social duties.
There's a bit of this master-slave dialectic that we see in Hegel here, which is that there's a certain ignorance on both parts, and it's for the educated to sweep in and try and change this, because the poor won't recognize their situation in and of themselves. They need a sort of benevolent higher class to look after them, because otherwise they will persist in the kind of maintenance of the current social order. And he's saying that, you know, the rich and guilty, essentially, of not trying to make that structural change, to not look on these people with pity, and to try and help them and support them and improve society.
The Hegelian view is also that the master needs the slave.
Exactly. So it's still, and obviously it still involves a maintenance. It comes
back to trust us, stay poor, we'll look after you.
There's nothing saying make these poor the rich.
No,
it's
nothing. No, because it actually infantilizes them. By saying that they can't look after themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Either that, or it says they don't have power and we'll never give them power. Whichever.
Completely. Yeah. Jack, Dar.
I mean, I think that seems to me to be true, Bruce, to an extent. But are they not in a situation where the poor are genuinely powerless? That there has to be some benevolent transformation from within the aristocratic class to enable them to sort out their own affairs.
Certainly.
At least to do so in a peaceful way. I mean, presumably the poor wouldn't be powerless to revolt. Presumably that is a real fear.
And you've had the introduction of a state police force by this time with Peel and the Peel reforms.
Don't forget there has been a lot of social unrest throughout this period, and a lot of attempted coups, a lot of attempted. So there is a real fear that if something is not done to address this issue, then there is going to be a widespread revolution and maybe an overthrow of the state.
Completely.
Okay, that's a very extreme example of it, but considering the number of different sort of social unrest and the amount of violence that was seen throughout this period.
And again, with the immensity of people moving into cities, there is this idea that locations can be, obviously, condensed bubbles of potential political violence.
But also people can travel a little bit more now as well. Because this was the beginning of the inception of the railways. Although very early mentioned, and people were able to move around a bit more as well, travel to places. And then you've got things such as the media, which is where you can influence ideas.
Certainly.
And influence other people that might have the same, agreements as you, or the same grievances with you against the state and the system. And they can easily be influenced by that.
It's curious that it's the educated class, or the intelligence, the academics, presumably, who are the mediator between the poor and the aristocrats. So, presumably, there's a lot of overlap. Between the academics and the wealthy.
Certainly. Certainly.
How does Disraeli understand that difference?
I mean, I think he's saying that there's a generational change taking place, that there are certain elements of the rich that will become enlightened, will become...
will this be a moral education?
Certainly, yeah, yeah. And obviously he is in the backdrop of a very morally repressive age. Again, Tories like him maybe have a nostalgia for an age that perhaps came before the Victorian generation, when, sort of morals and social mores became extremely repressed. And we've looked at someone like John Stuart Mill, who wasn't able to study at Oxford because he was a dissenter. You know, he wasn't part of the Church of England. There's still very, very strict, and actually compared for some of these thinkers, compared to the 18th century, there's a feeling that actually society has sort of become morally sort of more stringent and kind of repressing itself. So maybe people of an educated class who should be thinking about these issues should be looking to those lesser off than themselves, perhaps have siloed themselves away from social responsibility in an age of kind of moral repression and sort of keeping everything a little bit under wraps. Do we have any more points about Disraeli? Does anyone have anything?
I do think it starts in the, the benevolent landowner who builds these cottage estates. If you look at Watson Manor, I mean, those are fabulous cottages. Also Coleman Mustard. He builds all the cottages and schools and everything.
Very true. That's very interesting about the actual practicalities of living, because you have that sort of vision. You also have it contrasted with someone like Robert Owen, who again is seen as this kind of proto-communist visionary, who's building very regimented towns based around factories that he's starting to employ people on the basis of their merit. And he's trying to create societies where you're measured against your kind of utility, and you're sort of, you get a green wooden block, a painted green wooden block left next to your desk if you're succeeding in your quota for the day, but you get a red one if you've not managed to meet your target. Now, these people were seen as visionaries because they were housing their population. These work towns were housing their population, providing them obviously with their pay, their accommodation, supporting their families. But at the same time, for a Tory, it would be seen as kind of, well, what's this going to lead to if this kind of idea of sort of monitoring people and keeping them kind of as pieces in a great mechanism. Again, this idea of nostalgia, really not liking the kind of Enlightenment legacy of a mechanistic society, comes through as well, I would say. But we can move on from Egremont to the politics of, shouldn't say the politics of the 19th century, should say the politics of the 20th century, I'm afraid. This should say the politics of the 20th century. The politics of the 20th century unfolded amid the collapse of certain old certainties and search for new forms of political and moral order. The industrial, imperial and ideological revolutions that shaped the previous century that we've just seen culminated in global conflict, economic crisis and the emergence of mass democracy. Liberalism, once the creed of progress and individual autonomy, was challenged by collectivist movements on both the left and the right, from socialism and communism to fascism and corporatism. The First World War discredited faith in rational progress and Enlightenment universalism, giving rise to a generation of thinkers preoccupied with the limits of reason, the fragility of civilization, and the moral basis of political association. Across Europe, intellectuals grappled with the failure of idealism and the rise of totalitarian systems that sought to subsume the individual within the state. The interwar period witnessed the fragmentation of older traditions of authority, religious, moral, and aristocratic. While the post-1945 era brought welfare democracies, the Cold War and the challenge of technocratic governance. political thought turned inward, asking not merely how to design political institutions, but what it meant to belong to a political community in an age of mass politics and ideological extremism. In this shifting landscape, philosophers began to re-examine the nature of political experience itself, questioning whether politics could ever be perfected by abstract reason, or whether it must be instead understood as a contingent, historical, and deeply human activity. Thank you, Jack. May to D. Thank you, sir. Into this political whirlpool that we've just described, Michael Oakeshott emerges. He was born in 1901 and he passed in 1990. He, before we read this, he is the he's the uncle to a well-known journalist today, Sybil Oakeshott, who is the partner of the deputy leader of Reform UK, Richard Tice, who we've hosted at the University of Buckingham, and I had a chat with when we were in Buckingham. So there's a link there. But Michael Oakeshott differs substantially from his niece, and obviously I can't say what their political discussions would have been, whether they would have ever had one, but her opinions are certainly more on the libertarian sort of side that we've addressed in various seminars compared to Michael. He was among the most distinctive British political thinkers of the 20th century, a philosopher whose work bridged the intellectual traditions of idealism, historicism, and sceptical conservatism. He was born in Chelsfield, Kent, and educated at St George's School, Harpenden, before reading history at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. Oakeshott was formed in the waning years of what we call British idealism. He studied under J.M.E. McTaggart and was influenced by the moral and metaphysical legacy of Hegelian thought, particularly as mediated through figures like F.H. Bradley and Bernard Bosanquet. Yet his early encounters with the tragedies of the 20th century, he served briefly at the end of the First World War and later lived through the ideological cataclysms of the 1930s, led him to distrust utopian ambitions of both political rationalism and historical determinism. His first major work, Experience and its Modes of 33, established him as a philosopher concerned with the autonomy of human experience, rejecting the reduction of history, science, or practice to a single rational schema. After serving in military intelligence during the Second World War, Oakeshott joined the London School of Economics, succeeding Harold Lasky, much more to the left, as Professor of Political Science in 1951, a striking transition from Marxist to metaphysical skeptic that symbolised the shifting intellectual climate of post-war Britain. It was there that he published his celebrated essay, Rationalism in Politics, of 1947, articulating a vision of politics as a practical art grounded in tradition and experience rather than ideology or abstract reason. We see the Burkean tradition coming through here. Oakeshott's subsequent work, notably on human conduct of 75, deepened this philosophical skepticism into a theory of civil association, distinguishing between the moral practices of a free society and the instrumental logic of the purposive decline of systematic philosophy and the search for meaning within the pluralism of modern life. Though wary of party labels, his thought came to represent a distinctly English form of conservatism, sceptical, historical, and humane, grounded in the fragile inheritance of civil order rather than in any programmatic creed. On being conservative, this was a text published in 1956. Michael Oakeshott presents conservatism not as an ideology or political program, but a disposition, a temper of mind that values what is familiar, tested, and evolved over what is novel or uncertain. To be conservative for Oakeshott is to find satisfaction in existing arrangements and to prefer the known to the unknown, the tried to the untried, and the present to any speculative future. This attitude is not grounded in fear or hostility to change, but in an aesthetic and moral appreciation of the inherited world as a living achievement, the product of countless human choices and adjustments over time. He distinguishes this disposition from dogmatic traditionalism or reaction. It does not oppose change per se, but treats change as something to be approached cautiously, as repair rather than reconstruction. This is where his analogy of the ship, sailing the ship away from the iceberg, so the state as the ship comes in. You're not there to make substantial changes, change course completely, but you're there to avoid certain dangers. Politics in this sense is not an arena for the pursuit of perfection, but for the maintenance of order and civility. Oakeshott's conservatism is thus philosophical rather than partisan, a reflection on how human beings inhabit institutions, customs and practices whose value cannot be captured by abstract reason or ideological design. In affirming the modest virtues of continuity and familiarity, Oakeshott elevates the conservative disposition into a meditation on the art of living amidst the flux of modernity. So we've got a few little points here. I'll go through the first three. There's a couple of slides of this. We can analyse each one. So conservatism as disposition, not dogma. My theme is not a creed or a doctrine, but a disposition. So what are we maybe seeing in this passage? My theme is not a creed or a doctrine, but a disposition.
I think it's virtue-based.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned on the previous slide some virtues, continuity and familiarity. Yeah. I don't understand how those are virtues of individuals. What I do see is the idea that, or the importance of judgment. Steering a ship, you need to judge well. You can't just see an iceberg and avoid it. Some icebergs you can't see, etc. So it speaks to me of character, but I don't see continuity and familiarity as virtues of character. So I'm not quite sure.
I think
how you make good politicians out of this.
I think a certain idea of restraining oneself, of temperance, of moderation, would be seen as virtue. Jack, you know more about virtue than me. No, not in a practical sense. I just mean in a scholarly sense. But I'm sure you could elaborate more on that. But it also, I feel, relates a bit into Scruton as well. Continuity as a virtue. What would you say, Jack?
Yeah, no, exactly. But it's a practical virtue. That's especially pertinent to Oakeshott, because he's quite careful to brand his conservatism as something that is practical and pragmatic, but which is completely independent of any moral or metaphysical or religious claims. Now, I personally see a big tension there.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And I actually think that when he goes into that line of thinking, he's no longer a conservative, he's a full-out libertarian, because he's completely disinterested in terms of what people are doing with freedom. For him, the project of governance is maximising freedom within the rules. He reads just like Hayek.
Yeah.
He reads just like Locke. I think the distinctive notion of conservatism is that freedom is constituted by institutions, which we have seen in Burke and Scruton. But indeed, the one common thing, which maybe you don't find in Locke, is this emphasis on disposition. He is very good at showing how conservatism is something like an instinct.
Yeah,
and in that sense, very much allied with practical virtues. What you might call cardinal virtues, let's say in Aristotle, temperance.
An instinct, a precondition to prefer the known to the unknown.
Exactly, which is true, technically speaking.
Safer and to feel.
Yes.
But with cardinal virtues, you come back to a metaphysical position, whereas he's not accepting that.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing the criteria by which you see good political judgment versus bad.
I think it's
someone who says trust my instincts. You have no visibility. There's no evidence.
I think it's the idea of moderation and temperance and sort of restraining oneself from making too drastic a decision in either direction, because he's obviously not saying that everything needs to be maintained, but he's saying that we need to be,
It's very birth-like, isn't
it? It is, and it is sort of this idea that this is my cross to die on. If I'm going to make a judgment about something that needs to change, I need to wholeheartedly believe that it is something structurally that I can justify that needs to change. I can't just, on a whim say, well, this is wrong and this needs to be reformed, or this is, you know, something that's fundamentally, you need to invest yourself in the project of, if you want to transform things, you need to be wholeheartedly, you know, this is where I stand, and need to at least have contemplated it. And then, yeah, it is very Burkean.
But big decisions aren't whim versus authenticity. They are two very finely tuned, you know, options. You know, 2-child limit on benefits versus no 2-child limit on benefits. They're both tough situations. It's a tough decision to make, whichever way you go. But I'm not seeing how you evaluate a politician's decision to go one way rather than the other.
I guess the virtue is the deliberation when we're looking at the backdrop of this text. It's not being a stuffy old school parliament of the 1950s that doesn't do anything, but at the same time it's not a ideologically Soviet kind of you know, the Supreme Soviet in Moscow making decisions on that basis. You know, the virtue is the deliberation, the contemplation, the moderation.
The Soviet thing is institution. I mean, what you're saying is it's not Jeremy Corbyn hardline ideology.
Yeah.
It's you know, New Left or some other, you know, soft line
ideology. But just, I think, almost the process of deliberation. So it doesn't necessarily, you know, you can have wholehearted opinions, of course, but you have to be able to self-criticize, kick the tires of your opinions. No withdrawing into just complete conservatism in the sense of like everything is great because it's been passed down, but it's better than heading off in some radical direction without thinking about it. I suppose is the argument.
You can be pretty liberal and still have that character.
Yeah. But this is why, obviously, he is very much seen as a moderate thinker.
Well, I mean, what you were saying there, Sam, sounds just like something John Stuart Mill would write. I mean, we read him in the previous series. But yeah, but what is interesting is that the argument goes to almost ecology in terms of what kind of beings we are. We're adverse to change naturally, but it's something we have to adapt to.
Yeah.
But then he builds up the argument very carefully. So he begins with like tradespeople. Okay, so wherever you have projects and you have tools, you want the tools that are tried and tested, not radical new solutions.
Yeah.
There is a class of people whose vocation it is to go and explore radical new solutions. He says those are middle people. They're not the people doing the job, but they're not people who are so divorced from the job that they don't know anything about it. So they're somewhere between.
Yeah.
And then he starts to build this towards politics. He says, well, rules of conduct are just like tools. So we have rigid rules of conduct so that we know how to pass bills. And we know how that whole process is going to play out, whatever happens, and we know how we vote, and we know how taxes work, and we know that the government is definitely not going to say this tomorrow because that would be so outlandish and impossible for them to pull off. So we can then plan for our futures, again, very like Hayek. And then, so by that point, he's already in the sphere of politics.
Yeah.
But then he makes this sharp distinction between governance, you know, concerning itself with the rules of conduct, and then, you know, whatever you want to do with in your own private spheres.
Yeah,
it's interesting, but it's very. You use the title to call him a skeptical conservative. I say, yeah.
No, certainly.
Have barely a foot in sort of the traditional. I mean, in abstract, he's saying a lot of the right things, but then when he gets to actual, like, you know, in terms of like the relationship between conservatism and culture, that's no longer there.
Yeah.
A very modern notion. I mean, I was reading it and feeling that he's not so opposed to Thatcher.
Yeah,
he's part of that direction which conservatism went down, where it has no interest in culture, only in economics.
However, as except 3 reads, he will find small and slow changes more tolerable than large and sudden. So this is a very organic sense of reform, a certain sense of, well, in the Disraeli sense, to reform for maintenance of certain goods that we have inherited from the past. So certain things that we do cherish, whether that be kind of, you know, nostalgic ones, monarchy, the kind of more regal sense of, well, parades and these kind of things. Oh, thank you, Jack. Yeah, that'd be lovely. Parades and these kind of things, and they bring a sense of community and a sense of social cohesion. But reforms to other elements of society will be a process of changing to conserve, to maintain, you know, to adapt to a modern age and integrate new elements to be able to conserve the things that do bind us together and we cherish. So do we have any thoughts on that passage? He will find small, slow changes more tolerable than large and sudden, because I would say that opposes the idea that he's in a Thatcherite line, because the thing I find obviously so ironic about Thatcher is that I can't really see a conservative bone in her body in many senses. There really isn't an element of conserving very much. Even the idea of a society, which both Disraeli and Oakeshott are fully for, you know, conserving the things that do bind us, it's completely done away with that.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm being a bit unfair to.
No, I do know what you mean.
But he would conserve the culture for its own sake, but not because of the specific culture that it is. So. Yeah, I mean, so he buys into the logic that this stuff does bind us together in a particular way, and if you start to tamper with that, who knows what it's going to do. Which is, you know, it's interesting. But
perhaps a good analogy would be, we had this debate about whether certain controversial elements of museums should be taken down, whether they should be. So you had on the one side the kind of left who were saying they should be taken down, put away. They don't need to be in an exhibition, whether they be racist, whether they be a symbol of kind of occupation, a symbol of kind of bygone mores. You had the right who would say, no, this is part of our tradition, part of our heritage. We need to maintain them for understanding the past. But then you had the kind of adapt and change idea, which you see with some museums. I certainly remember when I was in St Andrews, the St Andrews Museum had this idea that what you do is you add past. Sorry, we're having some Wi-Fi issues. But
they can't hear you, so.
Oh, there we are. We may have just had a Wi-Fi issue, but I shall continue. Add in new elements of the exhibition that integrate to adapt and change, and thereby conserve, but thereby reform to conserve. Now that's obviously that's completely out of the context of Oakeshott's time, but I'm just, you know, I'm throwing that out there as a kind of analogy for, I think, where he would sit in this kind of paradigm.
It's a good balance. You say there on that parallel to Disraeli's social harmony, reform only to preserve. And indeed, this is, I think you find that in Burke. This idea that Oakeshott, I don't think, fully understands what he's saying on this subject. He said, and he does begin, you know, he says, maybe this is me too much of a philosopher coming at him. He's writing a text that is fairly accessible, but he says early on, change is a threat to identity. And, you know, ecologically speaking, that's true. But, well, that's maybe what I'm actually going to query, because some change is intrinsic to identity. You know, there are forms that grow and mutate, and we grow. You know, we're children, and then we're adults, and then we're old, and that change is intrinsic to our identity. You know, and it's part of. I mean, in a sense, you adapt to it, or maybe you fail to. Burke maybe did a better job of bringing that point home. For Burke, change is actually conservative. He defined conservatism as changing well, something like this. John Henry Newman, a similar age, actually 3 years before Disraeli and died in the same year, I noticed, he used to say that to be good is to change, to be perfect is to have changed often. So if you know how to change well, this is part of an authentic conservatism. I think he understands that at some level, but even Oakeshott is a bit cautious about the idea. But I think Burke is quite
open about. Will we use that analogy during the Burke one about rather than sledgehammering the whole wall down, you remove the brick that's faulty, or you remove the rotten element and replace that. You don't smash down the whole wall.
Yeah. Of course, Burke also talks about attending to the state with reverence as though you were attending to the wounds of your father.
So certainly.
Yeah, but
and just quickly, to be conservative is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, present laughter to utopian bliss. In this we see a suspicion of radical change or rationalist politics, as we've discussed. There's an emphasis on inheritance, experience and affection for that works. And parallel to Disraeli's social harmony, reform only to preserve. And present laughter is also this might sound very romantically British, but if you go back to discussions in what were famous during our kind of English Enlightenment, the coffee houses, so the equivalent of the salons in France, we had the coffee houses. The thing that Voltaire even comments on is that in England you can laugh about these things, and this is a tradition that carries through to this age. And some people might criticize it as a symptom of not taking the political system too seriously, but for many observers it's been seen as a virtue of the British political system, which is that for a long time, whether it be religion, whether it be politics, discussion in the alehouse, in the coffee house, has been one of a kind of a jovial affair. It's not a serious, if you start laughing about the king or you start laughing about the church and some of its issues, it's not something where someone in the corner of the pub or the coffee house is going to report you and dob you in for making some shun of a leader or of a certain religious disposition at that time. It's something where actually laughter is something that's a release, and perhaps trying to idealize a state where you have a certain vision of where you want society to go could maybe remove that very organic, very unique British element to political and religious discourse. A couple more here. Government is the umpire. The office of government is merely to rule, to preserve peace, not by imposing uniformity, but by enforcing general rules, a general framework. This is also an element that comes across in this analogy of the ship, because there's this other element that the state is there to guide, maybe not to row. It's not sort of really doing the heavy lifting. It's to direct society in certain ways into certain morally kind of valid, morally acceptable grounds. But it's not there to do the kind of heavy sort of this is the vision of the future. It's there to just help and aid the way that our society is going. It's about order. It's not about perfection. It's a government that's a guardian of fair play, not a social engineer. And this again resonates with these One Nation views of responsible and a certain idea of limited stewardship. And stewardship was something we were discussing again last week.
But it seems to be quite strange that on this point, Oakeshott would consider himself to be in the vein of Disraeli, because Disraeli certainly has a very clear moral vision for unifying the two nations. The two nations, not like actually the secession here. Disraeli has a very positive vision for I think for social reform and for tending to the poor.
Yeah.
And Disraeli, Oakeshott says, that's nothing to do with government. Government just sets the rules for people to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's all.
You could argue that in Disraeli's time there was a risk to stability that needed something to be done. and in Oakeshott's time there was maybe less of a risk. And what I'm seeing, and this is a philosophy of process and of character. It is not a philosophy of consequences. The idea that we steer and tweak and enforce general laws is an idea we don't take responsibility for the things that do happen. We indeed for the things we fail to achieve. And I kind of don't really buy into that as a value statement. I think politicians are there to strive for consequences.
And as much as Disraeli had a vision, Jack, I would also say, similarly, I don't believe that Disraeli was advocating any heavy lifting, in a sense, by the enlightened class. He wasn't saying that they're going to then suddenly transform. He's not, if you were going to say that an enlightened class was going to basically transform society, you'd be heading in the direction of Gramsci and this kind of idea that there would be an enlightened intellectual class that would lead everyone into this great future. I don't think Disraeli has a vision of any kind of heavy lifting taking place from these enlightened people. It's just that they would be better rulers to bring these, what he sees as two divided aspects of the nation together and to synthesize them and in the kind of critical way that Bruce was raising earlier, perhaps to avoid conflict more than to actually improve their lot. Even though he does talk about improving their lot, one could argue that there's no structural changes that Disraeli is advocating, nor is there any particular structural changes that Oakeshott is advocating.
This is the point I actually wanted to come to earlier. Maybe a good time to inject with it. In defense of Disraeli, I would suggest he's quite sincere. And I would suggest this because he seems to me to be very much an outsider. Yes, partly because of the heritage issue you talked about, but also I was reading quite carefully today this early chapter where he gives you a bit of a history of the politics and some of the key players in the politics from the leading up to the Glorious Revolution through to his day. And he holds very unconventional opinions, highly unconventional opinions. He thinks that James II was innocent of popishness. He thinks that actually return to communion with Rome is the dominant opinion of the public, and that's why there wasn't a papal plot, because if there was...
now I see why you're defending him.
No, but he says this in the text. He says if that was real, it would have happened. But he believes that is the dominant sentiment, and people just aren't doing anything about it. He a lot of things like this. He just had a very nuanced opinion on everything. He's very original. I was quite intimidated by everything how he goes through all these different subjects. So I do think Disraeli is sincere within attempts to save the Conservative Party by giving them a positive function. He's not. He doesn't seem to me to be a character who's banking on his own. He's not like he was there before and came up with this new idea. He's coming into the party.
I would agree. I do think he's quite authentic, and I think Victoria sees that because she certainly preferred him to the grand old man of Gladstone in the great rivalry between Gladstone and.
He had a favourite.
Okay. Now, obviously, again, on a power basis, you might not be surprised that she would prefer a Tory, but Gladstone was certainly a popular figure within the nation, but she still preferred Disraeli to Gladstone, and I think there is a certain level of authenticity that you do see in Disraeli. But I agree, it's very apparent.
And then just one more thing. I mean, I agree with your previous point about. He probably isn't going about to leverage all the might of the state to correct these issues. But people do have to take some responsibility for themselves at some level. That would be a very common intuition. But it is singular that Oakeshott. I think he does toe a hard line there. That's how I read this chapter. That he says like Disraeli would be one dreamer among others in Oakeshott's language. The state has no moral responsibility, except just to maintain the rules of the discourse. In that, he's pure libertarian, and not an ounce of conservatism in that, I would say.
And this is true. And when we look at this idea of conservatism and freedom, Oakeshott does say it's not all inconsistent to be conservative in government and radical elsewhere. you can have a society of free and creative individuals within a stable framework set out by government. Order enables progress, and freedom is sustained by restraint. And there's a philosophical underpinning of this idea of sort of one nation conservatism that we've been discussing. But yeah, I would certainly say that Oakeshott is developing further than Disraeli in terms of moving away from that kind of set sort of social responsibility idea. But again, returning to what we first discussed about Oakeshott, moderation and reconciliation, these are the virtues, to restrain, to deflate, to pacify, and to reconcile. The task of politics for Oakeshott is balance, not agitation. It prevents the encounter of dreams that breeds division. This is a core of a one nation ethos, reconciling classes, interests, and identities. So it's not about being at loggerheads with one another, not about really fighting politics for the sake of politics, but about really trying to decipher what is the best at that point in time for society. Is that a maintenance of the status quo, of what is in place, or is it a turn towards a change, a reform of an element of society?
Well, this is maybe this is the I think this is the point where he breaks apart a little. No, completely, maybe. I haven't had enough time to think about it. But Chesterton used to say that. What did he used to say? I don't remember his precise line, but he basically said you couldn't be completely tolerant because there were certain ideas. Oh yeah, there is a sort that stops sort. That is the only sort that should be stopped, and that's a very conservative idea, and that's not in Oakeshott at all, from what I read, and partly on this thing. So he's into change, which is great. Yeah. In a healthy change, he likes healthy change. Yeah. But the rules of the discourse are inflexible. And what happened when the discourse wants to change the rules of the discourse? He doesn't have an answer for that, I suspect.
That's because he's given up on metaphysics.
Well, yeah, he's a philosopher.
He's got nowhere to go.
Yeah, he said he had a philosophical heritage, but I find him a bit confused on this point.
I think this is very much with the context of ideological calamity that he's experienced in the lead up to this. If you change the structure, and if you fundamentally question the structure, in a kind of more Marxist sense, the superstructure of society, you risk moving in the direction of one of these totalitarian regimes that he's seen only, obviously, 10 years before, two totalitarian regimes take dominance across Europe. But I do think, even that choice of the word pacify does start to bring into question, how far is he saying that kind of political discussion can properly take place if you're pacifying people, if you're pacifying opinion, you're not just kind of
tamping down the pressures in society for change. And if he has no view, if he has no ideology, and he has no rational framework, as you say, to justify or warrant the rules that he suggests we should follow, if he's not holding on to the status quo, which I think is a kind of ideology, keep the status quo as a kind of ideology, then he's allowing change. But once you allow change, then how do you rationalize? He is in kind of a relativism almost, although he thinks he's not. Well, he's laying down certain points, but how does he justify them? He's got
he tries to root it in the intuitive or self-evident aspect of pragmatism, which is dogmatism. That's just dogmatism. Dogmatism. Well, I'm torn on pragmatism, like William James and stuff. It seemed to be sort of going in that territory. It can work.
It can be attractive and convincing, but I don't think ultimately it doesn't have a foundation. I'm not sure where the foundation is. If you don't have a history, if you don't have a God, if you don't have an ideology, then you're just floating.
we can continue that discussion.
Yeah, it's the boundary, isn't it?
And we're at the boundary of our series.
Got sucked in there.
Thank you for attending the Heritage series. It's been a genuine pleasure tracing the evolution of conservative thought from Plato and Augustine through Burke, de Maistre, Scruton, and finally to the modern idea of the One Nation. Your reflections, your discussions have made this series one of our most engaging yet, I'd say. Looking ahead, we'd love to hear thoughts. Would you like a short review and reflection session next week? I think we've probably answered that already. That it's a no, to consolidate these ideas. But what we are thinking of doing is moving straight on to the revolution of thought, beginning on Thursday, the 1st of December. Either way, thank you for the insight, humour and curiosity you've all brought to the table. It's exactly what keeps this club alive. Stick around for a drink or just get drunk on the sweet nectar of knowledge. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everyone online. It's been a pleasure for the series. Thank you. And yeah, we're currently penning our next series. So stay tuned for more intellectual gobbets. And hopefully Jack and I can bolster our podcast count as well in the meantime.
Yeah, indeed.
But yeah, until then, thank you very much for attending.